It's almost about that time, right about now.
Right about now. Funk, bunk, 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 soul brother.
Well, hey, everybody. Welcome to the Right About Now podcast. This is John Small. On today's episode, Alexander Stille will join me to talk about his fascinating new book, The Sullivanians, Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wild Life of an American Commune. Now, Alexander uncovered the rise and fall of a mostly forgotten cult that flourished on the Upper West Side of New York City in the 70s and the 80s. This happens to be the same neighborhood where I was born and lived for the first 8 years of my life, and I don't remember hearing anything about the Sullivanians. And like so many cults, they sort of flew under the radar. They started off as a utopian experiment with the promise of freeing people from the repressive force of their parents and the traditional nuclear family structure. But unlike other cults, there was no, robed guru leading this cult. There was no David Koresh-like religious fanatic. Instead, the leader was a Marxist psychoanalyst by the name of Saul Newton. And the Sullivanians were also not some sort of fringe organization. They actually made and had a lot of money, and they owned killer real estate on the Upper West Side. And given the sort of legitimacy of what they were doing, and I just did a quote sign, because it was under the guise of psychoanalysis, they were actually able to lure some of the brightest and most talented people in New York City into this group. People like the artist Jackson Pollack and the singer Judy, the dancer Lucinda Childs, even the great crime writer Richard Price, who wrote on the show The Wire, which is one of my favorite TV shows of all time. And like so many cults that we've talked about on this show, what started off as a sort of communal experiment that I guess was helpful to some people devolved into a highly paranoid and insular group of people, with the therapists controlling virtually every aspect of their patients' lives, including where they lived, the kind of work they were allowed to do, how often they were allowed to see their sexual partners and their children. And in fact, Saul Newton, in classic cult fashion, required many of his patients to have sex with him. So my guest, Alexander Stille, is a professor at the Columbia Journalism School. He's also an accomplished journalist who has written for the New York Times, the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books. He did countless interviews to reconstruct the inner workings of this cult, which was clearly hidden in plain sight in the middle of Manhattan. In our interview, he talks about the origin story of the Sullivanians, what they believed, how they attracted such intelligent people and made them do some incredibly unintelligent things, the power of groupthink, and the tale of how the Sullivanians ultimately fell. So, without further ado, I bring you my interview with Alexander Stille. Alexander Stille, welcome to the Right About Now podcast.
Thanks for having me.
All right, so this is a fascinating story. Let's start at the beginning with the founding of this cult. And I think we should start by understanding who Saul B. Newton was.
Well, so he was a guy who was born in 1906 in New Brunswick, Canada, moved to the U.S., went to the University of Wisconsin, then became a labor organizer and a communist in Chicago in the 1930s. He then went and fought in the Lincoln Brigade in Spain as part of the anti-fascist resistance to Franco, which gave him a lot of sort of credibility in left-wing circles. He then came back, and right after he then fought in World War II over in Europe. And after World War II, he started to work at the White Institute in New York, which is this psychoanalytic institute that Harry Stack Sullivan and others founded, where he's really exposed to the ideas of Sullivan and psychoanalysis. And that's where he meets this woman, Jane Pierce, who is already a trained psychotherapist working there. And he's been married 3 times already. He dumps wife number 3 and marries Jane, who becomes wife number 4. And Jane's credentials as an MD and a trained psychotherapist create the possibility for him actually becoming a psychotherapist. One of the kind of dirty secrets of psychoanalysis is that anybody can be a psychotherapist if you or I are prepared to pay them to listen to us. And so you don't, you need a license. You don't have to have a degree. You need, if I want to get reimbursed by my insurance company, the therapists have to have a license. But if you don't care about getting reimbursed by insurance, anybody is free to call themselves a psychotherapist. So he becomes the director of this new thing called the Sullivan Institute, but Jane has the kind of credibility to give it a kind of air of seriousness. And a number of interesting, innovative young psychotherapists follow her from the White Institute and go to do training at this new institute. And so the initial 2 quickly become 6, become 10, become 12. And by then you're up to seeing hundreds of patients, because if each person sees 20 patients, let's say, you start to have a certain amount of critical mass. So Newton, even though he's uncredentialed, is the director of the institute, which gives him power over the assigning of patients. And then they came up with a rather brilliant idea which really magnified his power. In 1971, they decided to create a training program which could be used for, instead of the people who'd been brought in as therapists before that, often had medical degrees or had PhDs in psychology that they'd gotten somewhere else. And then they would sort of go to the Sullivan Institute to practice. They thought, what if we trained our own people? They don't even necessarily have to have finished college. In fact, better if they haven't, because they won't have learned the wrong things. They won't have read a lot of Freud and read a lot of, this or that, psychoanalysts. We'll be able to form them in the way that we think we should. So you have these people who are, 20, 25 years old with no experience, who are taught to do things in a certain way, and Newton controls their life. He controls their ability to earn a living, so they're living in a Sullivanian apartment. Their community and their friendship is composed entirely of Sullivanians. Their ability to make money and earn a living is dependent on Saul funneling patients to them. And so he also uses a lot of the people in this training program are young 20-something women, some of them quite attractive. And so, he demands that they go on dates with him, which means have sex. He would demand people, in some cases patients, to give him oral sex during sessions and then pay him for their troubles. He would do the same with young therapists that were in supervision with him, because, there was also a kind of financial dimension to all this, which is everybody in the group is in therapy, and that means generally being in therapy at least 2 or 3 times a week, which means that a substantial amount of your income is going, the rents are cheap on the Upper West Side, but a lot of your money is going into the therapy.
Is the philosophy called Sullivanianism? Like, how did they position it?
I don't know what they would have called it. They wrote a theoretical book called The Conditions of Human Growth, which they took very seriously and which makes for somewhat strange reading now. It's quite dense and turgid, and it lays out a theory of human growth, which they thought was quite scientifically grounded, but actually has no empirical evidence to support it. But what they took, Jane Pierce, who was really the kind of theoretical brains of the operation, was a woman who had a medical degree from the University of Chicago and had studied at the William Allenson White Institute in New York, which is to this day a very prestigious neo-Freudian institute that was founded by Harry Stack Sullivan, among others, who was one of the kind of founders of what's sort of known as interpersonal psychology. The idea that, Freud was all focused on first few years of your life and the Oedipus complex and inner conflicts between the id and the ego and the very early life of people. And Sullivan insisted that there were phases of life that were very important, that people continued to grow into adulthood, that you needed to look at society that people grew up in and the various relationships in their life, including in the present. And that people could, in fact, recoup phases of development that they had missed out on earlier in life. One of those phases, things like parallel play when you're a small child and you interact with another toddler, or a phase that he referred to as chumship, which is this period when people are like, 9 to 12 before they become fully adolescent. They form very strong attachments to peers of the same sex they get very close to and have very close relationships. So Sullivan believed in these phases and the possibility of continued growth into adulthood through exposure to different kinds of people. And he did quite innovative work with schizophrenic patients who he had living together communally and who did quite well in that setting. And so Jane Pierce and her husband, Saul Newton, said, okay, let's apply this idea to everyone. What if lots of us had the opportunity to live communally? What if people really need exposure to multiple people during their life? Then the family is by definition limiting and suffocating. Monogamy and monogamous marriage is limiting and suffocating. So we need to get people to branch out. We need to get them to explore. This is how they're really going to come into their own. On top of it, they were Marxists and believed that the nuclear family was sort of the pillar of capitalist reproduction. And so family was the society's agent to turn, little children into good, productive citizens who would do what their parents did and keep the system going. And so they felt we need to break that. If we're going to have a new kind of society, we need to have a new kind of person, a person who has been encouraged to grow and to explore and to leave the comfort of the family. So they began advising their patients to, have lots of sex with lots of people, preferably not too much with their spouse, to then live with each other in large group apartments, is sort of replicating what Sullivan was doing with the patients with schizophrenia. And this then, by that point, we're in the 1960s, and it kind of fit with the whole sort of ethos of the age of Aquarius and communal living. And there were thousands of communes sprouting up around the country. The Black Panthers were creating a kind of model of community that they found interesting. And there were, a whole kind of counterculture growing up of people who'd been protesting the Vietnam War, who were criticizing capitalism, who wanted, a life of greater authenticity, sexual exploration, and so forth. And so they were quite successful in bringing people into this community, and it sort of fit the culture of the time.
Yeah, I mean, a lot of times with the success of cults like this is that they have good timing and they tap into kind of the beliefs of the time. And this is a time where a lot of people were breaking with traditional models, right? Like the traditional nuclear family and traditional government structures, et cetera. So this is the 60s. And talk about where we are sort of with the sexual revolution, because this whole idea of polygamy and stuff kind of fits during this era, because this is sort of the era also of free love, and right when the pills comes into play, and this is before AIDS, right? That was also significant.
Yeah, I think that for me, one of the things that when I looked at the particularly the dates, the Sullivan Institute is formally begun in 1957, which is the date that the pill is actually submitted to the Federal Drug Administration for authorization. It then gets authorized in 1960. So there's already this we're on the cusp of a revolution, and you have a kind of growing dissatisfaction with the kind of Ozzie and Harriet, a father knows best kind of 1950s life. You have, things like Betty Friedan's feminine mystique and the unhappiness of traditional housewives who suddenly feel their lives are empty and hold nothing for them because they have no active role. And so those are kind of preconditions. And the pill seems like a total game changer to everyone, which in many ways it was. And what it did was it allowed you to separate sex from childbearing. It allowed you to have sex without guilt. It allowed you to have sex without worrying about who the father of the child might be because you were protected. And so I think they felt that we've been doing things for centuries in a certain way because of the problem of uncertain paternity, property rights, the father's position being threatened by the possibility that somebody else's sperm might, have impregnated their wife. And suddenly you say, we can now completely rewrite the rules. These rules about monogamy and possessiveness and nuclear family were all organized around this idea that no longer has any reason to be. What if we were completely free to reorganize the rules of life in a way that actually just made us happy, that fit with what our desires were? Let's be honest. People want to sleep with multiple people. They say, I'll love you forever, but of course they have attractions to other people. Why not live following your desires and allowing yourself to be as fulfilled as you can? What if you could throw off the ethos of possessiveness and jealousy? And if your wife was doing that while you were doing that, you both might be much less. Might be much happier, and you wouldn't resent your spouse because she was limiting you or he was limiting you. And that was kind of the idea. And so, in a sense, this makes a lot of sense for this period of time between the introduction of the pill and the AIDS crisis of the 1980s, in which all of a sudden then sex becomes much more complicated, and the idea that you can have free sex without consequences suddenly doesn't look so possible any longer. And so there's this kind of 25-year window in which anything goes and you can rewrite the rules. And that's what effectively this group was trying to do.
Right About Now is powered by AG1 by Athletic Greens. I've been looking for an advertising partner for the show, and I am happy to have finally partnered with AG1. We actually found each other at a podcast convention in Vegas last month. I literally had just guzzled a packet of AG1 in some water. Then I went to this conference and met a rep from the company. And I told her that the food at the hotel we were staying in was so terrible that I was happy that I had brought the AG1 with me. We were literally in a food desert. And without that AG1 pack, I think I would have passed out. Now, if you are not familiar with AG1, it is a powder that you mix with water, and voila, you have all the vitamins and minerals you need for the day. I am constantly looking for supplements that aren't a pain in the butt to take, and especially when you're traveling and you have to separate all the supplements and put them in little separate baggies. It's such a pain. AG1 is a great solution. Every scoop is packed with 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food sourced ingredients. But this is the best part. It actually tastes really good. It's not like a lot of healthy drinks that taste like celery and spinach water. Not true with AG1. I usually gulp it in 3 gulps. And I find that it helps with my energy and just my overall mood. Athletic Greens is offering Right About Now listeners a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Here's what you have to do. You go to athleticgreens.com/rightaboutnow. That is athleticgreens.com/right, WRITE, about now, to get that special deal. I hope you enjoy it. Let's talk about who the patients were. Some of the early followers are pretty well-known people. I mean, Jackson Pollack.
Yeah, he was a patient, and he was brought into it by Clement Greenberg, who was the most kind of influential art critic of the late 1940s and 1950s and was one of Pollack's big champions. And Clement Greenberg brought dozens of artists into therapy. It was sort of seen, Greenberg was very influential and the artists wanted to please him because he made and broke reputations. And so if he said you needed therapy and you're sort of becoming, a complete person was dependent on getting into therapy, you got into therapy. So you had all these artists getting into therapy, Kenneth Noland, a very well-known abstract expressionist, Jules Zalitsky, and lots of others, Larry Poons, the dancer Lucinda Childs, the singer Judy Collins was in therapy. And so you had these really smart, interesting people, and they, of course, were already interested in counterculture. So the idea that we don't have to follow the same dull rules that everybody else has been following, and we want to live in a more authentic way, and we want our lives to be centered around our own creativity rather than on fitting into society's traditional mold of what an adult is supposed to be. And so part of that involves sending your kids away to boarding school so that Jules Zalitsky, the painter, gets into therapy, and very quickly they advise him to send his young daughter away to boarding school. So instead of changing diapers and reading bedtime stories and sleeping with the same woman, he's having lots of affairs and focusing on his work and having a great time. And for a while that, was an appealing thing, cultural milieu. And that, of course, then gave a lot of prestige to younger people getting into therapy. Like, wow, there are all these smart, creative people doing this therapy. They must know something, and I'll get into it too. And they had a very, in some ways, quite exciting life that this community generated. They would have parties on Friday and Saturday evening, and lots of people got into it. Even rather than starting with therapy, they might simply be invited to a party with a friend of theirs, and here are all these people, young, cool, hip, smart, people living in New York. And you could be a shy, introverted guy, and some woman would come up to you and say, "Do you have a date tonight?" And that meant, "Are you going to go home with me?" And so,
yeah. So it sounds kind of fun. I mean, you get to have sex with as many people as you want. You get to have the validation of a quote unquote trained therapist. It all sounds utopian and wonderful, and yet it's not. It's more than that, right? I mean, one thing that the students are asked to do is to basically give their children away to boarding schools. A lot of them are sent to boarding schools, or they're just put in separate homes so that they're not really around their parents that much, so that their parents can focus on their own issues, which is basically just like child abuse.
Yeah, I mean, the thing is that what people didn't quite understand initially is that they were giving a lot of power to these shrinks,
Mm-hmm.
and that the therapists were controlling their lives to a really unhealthy degree. And so, so it's all fine and well to say you need to date multiple people and put yourself out there and make yourself available to people. But then it also came with a series of kind of very strong do's and don'ts, like there's something wrong with you if you wanted to be alone on a given evening and read a book. You should be with somebody else. Even if you're not having sex, you should be sleeping with one of your same-sex friends and bonding with them. So there was a kind of compulsion to the whole thing. And then let's say you were really into one of the people you were dating and you wanted to see that person often. Suddenly your shrink is saying, "Hey, wait a second. No, you're getting into what they call the focus. And so you've got to stop seeing that person so much. You've got to see other people." They would often break up relationships if they were getting too close. And so you realize that you were actually giving up instead of it being a freeing thing, you were giving up freedom as well. And then, these kids who were sent away to boarding school, in some cases had, really, really bad experiences. People were sent away at age 5, age 7, even age 3 in one case. And, the places in this country that would accept a child of 5 are not a place you would want to have a kid. And some of these places.
Do you tell one story, I think, of a boy who doesn't want to go to boarding school and is looking at boarding schools, and then he's talking to the headmaster, and all of a sudden the parents just leave him there, right? They just drop him off there. They didn't even give him warning.
Yeah. And he says, "Excuse me, I have to leave." And the principal of the school said, no, you're not leaving. And his parents don't even turn around to say goodbye to him. He said they duped me and they didn't have the guts to say goodbye. And that kid, went to, boarding school after boarding school, didn't learn to read until he was 11 because these were all sort of completely disorganized, very sort of loosey-goosey progressive schools where
One of the boarding schools was in Arizona, and it sounded really shady, right? It was like...
Yeah, that was really, really bad. That place was closed down because of systematic brutality that the director, used against kids there. That was really, really bad. And so these kids, in a sense, what this group was doing was offering people a kind of extended adolescence. And so that's great for a while. Let's say you were too shy and uptight in college to ask out the person you had a crush on and live your life as freely as you wanted. Now you were in a situation where it was going to happen. And the price of that was the kids all had to disappear because there's no room for little children in a college dorm.
And the parents themselves, so it's not just therapy and sending your kids that's already pretty bad. But the parents themselves, like the group then starts only interacting with the group. They start living in sort of single sex living situations, right? Like it becomes more of a commune situation, but in the middle of Manhattan.
Yes. And then it becomes step by step more insular. The need on the part of the therapist to control the people in the group increases, so that one of the things that happens in the early years between, let's say, the mid and late 60s and the mid 70s is it was a place with a lot of spontaneity and creativity. You had, Lucinda Childs giving a dance class and the painter Al Loving giving painting classes and people doing pottery and having rock bands and a comedy group and Richard Price writing sketches for, a comedy night. And all that sounds great. And then at a certain point, when the theater group becomes really popular, the leadership thinks, we got to take this over. So the theater group is becoming too popular. And so this becomes a vehicle for control. So this thing happens in 1977 when the leadership essentially takes over the theater group and everybody in the group has to become part of what they call the Fourth Wall Repertory Company, this theater company that they found, and they buy a theater on the Lower East Side. And so what had been a kind of bottom-up kind of fermenting of creativity becomes a top-down leadership-driven thing in which the leadership is deciding, what plays we're going to put on and who's going to do what. And a lot of the spontaneity and creativity goes out of it. So there's that step, which is very important. And then in 1979, there's an accident at the nuclear plant known as 3 Mile Island near Harrisburg, Pennsylvania.
It was the first step in a nuclear nightmare. As far as we know at this hour, no worse than that. But a government official said that a breakdown in an atomic power plant in Pennsylvania today is probably the worst nuclear reactor accident to date. There was no apparent serious contamination of workers, but a nuclear safety group said that radiation inside the plant is at 8 times the deadly level, so strong that after passing through a 3-foot thick concrete wall, it can be measured a mile away. Gary Shepard reports from Harrisburg.
And the leadership freaks out, and they're convinced that the government is lying about the amount of radiation coming out of the plant, that New York is in danger, they need to leave. Several of the senior women in the group are pregnant at the time. So they decide to decamp, evacuate New York, and go down to Orlando, Florida. And the entire, 250 people go down to Orlando and spend 10 days in a motel, getting drunk and having sex in Howard Johnson's, expecting that the world is ending, except then the world doesn't end. New York doesn't end up dying of nuclear contamination. But this becomes a kind of moment in which the paranoia and the fear of the outside world becomes sort of systematized into the group's life. So they then set up, you can no longer eat food that's been grown in the Northeast. And so they set up their own food co-op. You have to buy your food at the food co-op. And everybody has to listen to, they're listening 24 hours a day to 2 radio stations so they can pick up on some other nuclear accident that might be happening somewhere. that you don't know about. And they set up guard system at the headquarters of the group and a security squad. Everything is getting, slightly militarized after 3 Mile Island. And then the AIDS epidemic hits in the early 80s, and that becomes a reason or an excuse to separate people even more drastically from the outside world. You can't eat in a restaurant in New York because all the waiters are gay and you're going to get AIDS from them. And so you have to go 100 miles from New York to eat in a restaurant, crazy stuff. And you can then only have sex with people in the group and so on and so forth. So these become ways of further separating people in the group, from the outside world. Kids who are in boarding school are told they're not allowed to come back to New York, which of course is ridiculous because they're not, unless they're doing something particularly risky, any more at risk of getting AIDS in New York than anywhere else. But these become ways of isolating people and keeping them in the kind of grasp of the leadership.
So people start defecting. Some people start leaving. And this reminds me of like what you hear about a lot with Scientology. When they leave, they're often harassed or made to feel, they've certainly alienated from the rest of the people in the group and then often harassed. You tell the story of one former kind of high-level Sullivanian who left the group.
Yeah, so what happened is the guy who left was a prominent therapist in the group who had been trained by them. And he decides he's had enough. He doesn't like what he's doing as a therapist and feels he's doing things that are really unethical and destructive of his patients' lives. And moreover, he wants to marry and make a family with a woman that he's dating, and he's tired of having his relationships broken up. So they decide to leave, the two of them. And moreover, they help a couple of other people who want to get out to leave, because some of the people in the group have been out of touch with anyone else in their life for like 15 years. And so the idea of leaving is almost impossible for them to conceive. So he's then seen as a kind of subversive element who is undermining the group, and two members of the group ambush him in the Union Square subway station in New York City and dangle him. They're wearing like ski masks or something, but he knows who they are. He recognizes they're people that he, one of them was like a former roommate of his. And they dangle him over the side of the tracks and say, next time we're going to throw you in front of the train if you keep this up, which fortunately they didn't do, but they also beat up another defector who was a good friend of this person. And there's kind of increasing spiral of violence. They do something really crazy where they basically vandalize the house that's next door to the building that they own on 100th Street and Broadway, because these young kids who live in this building were disrespectful to them. And so they basically just trashed the place, and they could have easily, hurt someone or been arrested or had police come along in the middle of this sort of punitive raid. So there was a kind of increasing sort of craziness to things in the late 80s. And one of the things that then happens that really breaks the group open is a woman who had been in the group for a very long time, like 17 years, at age 41, has a child with a guy in the group. And after the child is like a few months old, she's told to stop breastfeeding. And then she's told that she's not allowed to see her daughter. And the daughter has been assigned to like a babysitter and is living sort of, at least nominally, in the father's apartment. And the mother is denied all access to her child. And the mother, as you can imagine, is incredibly distraught, incredibly upset, gets more and more desperate, and finally goes to see a lawyer, and at the urging of one of the defectors who's already left. And the lawyer says, you need to kidnap your own child. You as the mother have a right to your child. So if you take the child, it's not kidnapping, it's just your right. And so she hires two bodyguards, and they wait for the babysitter to come out in the morning with a stroller to take the child for a walk. And the bodyguards immobilize the babysitter, and the mother takes the child, and she goes off into hiding. And that then provokes a custody battle with the father, and then the whole thing becomes kind of finally brought out to the open. The mother then gives a series of interviews to the Village Voice and other media, and there are a bunch of lawsuits that end up dividing and weakening the group to a great degree. It's kind of the beginning of the end.
The great unraveling sort of happens with, I mean, it's sort of a series of little things, right? But that was one of the major events. And then this article that you said that you mentioned, these are a series of articles that come out in The Voice, really depict the Sullivanians as, you know, like a bizarre love cult, I think they're called. And, you know, they talk about their psychotherapist. So what ultimately happens to the Sullivan Institute?
Well, so by the late 80s, as I mentioned, there are these lawsuits going on that are draining. They're having to pay for lawyers, and all of that is quite costly. They're suffering defections. There are fewer people living in the building that they bought on 100th Street. There's a mortgage to be paid. They decide maybe we should sell off. They owned four significant pieces of property: a big hotel in the Catskills, which they use as a kind of summer retreat, a theater on the Lower East Side, a big building on West 91st Street, which was their headquarters and the residence of the leadership, and a building on 100th Street and Broadway. And so, and meanwhile, Saul Newton by the late 80s is becoming senile, and his power is waning. When he then is no longer able to control the group, he's put into, first they move him out into an apartment and then into a hospital. And it leaves two of his wives, his sixth wife and his fifth wife, who are both therapists in the group, who begin fighting with each other. Their lawsuits, they sell property. The whole thing falls apart. They can't sustain the group. And by 1991, it effectively dissolves because they've sold off the theater and the property in the Catskills, and everybody kind of scatters. So, although interestingly, some of the people remain in Sullivanian apartments to this day, in fact, and are still very loyal to the ideas behind it, even though they're not in an organized group. And others, you know, break with the group and they suddenly get back in touch with relatives they haven't spoken to in 15 years. And in some cases, they discover their parents are dead. In other cases, they reconnect with relatives they haven't seen and are welcomed back by them. You know, it's almost like for some of these people, like Rip Van Winkle, where they felt they'd been asleep for 20 years and suddenly they go out into the wider world and discover it's a whole new world.
You know, so many of the people that were members of this group, like you said, are artists and intellectuals in New York City, you know, Manhattanites and, you know, sophisticated. And I think a lot of times our impression is that people who join cults are dumb or ignorant or fanatics, but that's not the case. And honestly,
Yeah.
in my own experience in talking to other people in cults, oftentimes a lot of people who are in cults are very well educated. So I think it's very hard for people to understand how you could be so tricked if you knew so much, how you could.
Yeah.
What is your impression of that in this case?
Well, one of the things is that generally people have found that people get into cults in their early 20s, which is the case of most of the people in this group. And so this is a moment in which you have detached yourself from your family. You no longer have the support of your family, and you're looking to be more independent. You don't want to be dependent on your family. So let's say, you know, you grew up in Kansas, you've moved to New York, you're doing a graduate program, you're lonely, you don't know people, you're feeling kind of vulnerable. You realized that you never dealt with a lot of the stuff of your past, and maybe you need therapy. You're in New York and lots of people are doing therapy. You're looking for a roommate and you see a roommate wanted ad and you move into an apartment, and there are these smart young people that offer you community and they're in therapy. And so they say, I think you need to see somebody. So a young person, you know, almost by definition, when you go into therapy, you're in a moment of crisis or distress. Otherwise, why are you in therapy? And so you go into therapy and you start talking about your problems to a sympathetic adult. And as you're speaking and getting it off your chest, you start to feel better. And you attribute the fact that you are feeling better to the brilliance of this person sitting across the table from you. This person has actually relieved my suffering. They're really special. They're amazing. And that's called transference. It's a process that Freud identified early on as he was dealing with patients in psychoanalysis, where they would attribute, sort of magical powers of healing to the psychotherapist because it's a special relationship. You may be telling that person secrets that you've not told your closest friends, and you feel a bond. And your parents weren't so great, but here's this adult who's like the great parent that you never had, the father or mother that you wish you'd always had. And that's a very powerful relationship. And well-trained psychotherapists are taught to short circuit that process of idealization so that the therapist is able to tell the patient, look, I'm not a god. I don't walk on water. You're experiencing this because of the nature of this relationship. And so it's not me. It's what's going on here that you're feeling. But the Sullivanian therapist said, yes, you're right. I'm really brilliant and you can't live without me. And if you were to be without this therapy, you'd probably go crazy, commit suicide, be on drugs, become a prostitute, or, commit suicide.
Do you think they believe that, or was it all about power?
I think a lot of it was about power. I mean, I had one of my interview subjects was trained as a therapist, and she said, I was told to tell people that, but I didn't really believe it.
Mm-hmm.
And so I felt like I had to say that. And then one of my patients kind of laughed at me because I realized I didn't say it very convincingly.
Yeah.
So I think there were people that believed it and people who understood it was kind of a line. But I think that there is, unfortunately, the process of transference does work both ways. It really feeds a narcissistic desire for adulation. And so I think you do come to believe, wow, I really am amazing. I really am a healer, and my patients really do need me. So I think some of them did believe it. And then that, of course, makes them much more convincing in feeding that line to their patients.
Yeah, there's also that power of groupthink. Talk a little bit about that. It just becomes, it's amplified by the group. When a lot of people in a very kind of sequestered environment all believe a certain thing, it gets reinforced. Even if you begin doubting
right.
It's so reinforced by the group, it's hard
yeah.
to doubt it.
Yeah, no, I think that's really important because what in a way was kind of amazing, at least from the point of view of social control, is that so you were in therapy and you were getting the word from your therapist that your parents were terrible people, that you needed to have nothing to do with them. But you're also having weekly house meetings with the people living in your apartment, and they're telling you the same things. They're telling stories of how terrible their parents were. Everybody is supposed to tell stories about their lives in these meetings. And if you were to say, hey, actually, my parents weren't that bad, and my mom, she could be a little overbearing, but I know she really loves me. They would say, you're kidding yourself. You're whitewashing things. Look at what about the time she did X.
Mm-hmm.
You see, she's really, you think she was trying to help you, but she was really trying to smother you. You think that's love. That's not love.
Yeah.
That's hate.
Right.
And so, so that what the therapist is telling you and the people that are telling you, they don't have no financial interest in doing it. They're your friends. They're your roommates. They're the people you hang out with and play music with and sleep with. And so they're all telling you the same thing and you come to believe it. So what was kind of brilliant is if it was only the therapists that were telling you this thing, but it's everybody that you know that is telling you. So that, for example, in one of the more tragic cases that I wrote about, where a woman whose husband had died as a pilot in the Vietnam War. So she has two small kids and loses her husband, gets into therapy, And almost the first thing the therapist does is say, you've got to send your 2 little girls away to boarding school. So imagine these poor young children who've lost one parent now lose the other effectively.
Mm-hmm.
And then bit by bit, the therapist is telling her, don't go see your kids, have as little contact with them as possible. You're bad for them. You're toxic. Your parents, like this woman, as it happened, her parents ran a funeral home. So the therapist could say, don't you understand? Your family is literally death.
Yeah.
That's what your family is. And you think you came out of that without absorbing that? You're death too to your kids. You need to stay the fuck away from them.
Mm.
And so then your roommates are telling you the same thing. You're having doubts. And you're saying, I feel so bad because my child is really lonely and miserable at boarding school and wants me to go see her. And they say, bad idea, Jody. You need to stay tough. You're bad for them. And so you start to believe it.
Yeah.
Because these are your friends that are telling you that. It's not just your therapist.
And then also you become friends with all these people in the group. And then for so many years, this is your friend circle. So leaving is not only are you leaving the cult and your belief system that you hold so dear, but also if you decide that, now you're leaving your friends behind. So I think there's you talk about the split consciousness. Talk about that, what that is.
Yeah. Well, I think that what happens for many people in groups of this kind is that you're on the one hand, you start out and you're buying into most of what the group is offering. But then there are things that don't sit right with you. Your therapist behaves in a way that seems really unorthodox and unprofessional. You're forced to do something that you don't like. You're forced to sleep with somebody you don't like. And you're registering these negative experiences that are making you question your belief in the wisdom of the group. And so you have to do something with that. And, when you have that kind of conflicted feeling, it's known in psychology as cognitive dissonance, where you're having to filter out negative information that doesn't jibe with the life that you're leading. One good example of it that I give is when this whole 3 Mile Island thing happens. One of the people I interviewed was a medical doctor, a very smart guy. And he said, I knew the stuff they were telling us about radiation and New York was total bullshit, but I had to go along with it. And so that was a place where I began to have a second consciousness in my mind where I was putting these things that didn't make sense to me that I knew were crap, but I continued living the life. He stays in the group for another 7 years after that, even though he's filing away things like some of the things they're saying about AIDS don't make sense. I know I can't get AIDS from gay waiters, but I'm not eating in restaurants. So whenever that happens, the cognitive dissonance is increasing, where there are more and more things that don't fit. I'm leading this one life, and to lead this life, I have to believe that these leaders are right about everything. But I'm meanwhile creating a ledger on the other side of my mind of things that don't fit that picture. And so that cognitive dissonance kind of increases, and people can deal with it in one of two ways, which is either by rewriting the history and making the facts comport to their idea of themselves, or changing their life. And some of the people changed their life and some of them didn't.
It's really interesting because you can have two thoughts at the same time. You can find value in some of the things maybe that the Sullivanian teachings were giving you, but at the same time, also see that there's some very dangerous and destructive things going on. And I think sometimes people, when they're in that situation, think that they feel like it, because it's been what they perceive as a life transforming thing, they give all this other crazy stuff happening a pass, because they're like, it is, like you said, it's sort of an all or nothing belief system where it's like, you have to, if you got to be all in.
Yeah.
And so you trick yourself in that way.
And people found strategies for dealing with that. Like one of the people I interviewed would say, he was starting to have real doubts, and he hated participating in certain group events, but there were like a couple of nights a week in which their theater would put on kind of musical events for kids in the community. And so they had like a rock band that he would play in, and they would take requests from kids in the group and make up songs and let people perform. So he liked that, but he hated being there when one of the leaders was directing the theater and telling everybody what to do and screaming at people. And so he's described it as being like, we were like people in a prison where they'd found part of the prison yard where the searchlight doesn't reach. And so you could hang out there with your friends and have a good time. And so it's kind of weird. So his friendships, he was very close to lots of people in the group, and he ended up staying nearly to the end of the group. And so he's making a kind of distinction, like, I really like my friends and I really like the life. I just don't really like the leadership. And so that was his kind of way of dealing with it. So if I can avoid contact with leadership as much as possible and hang out with my friends, that's the compromise I'll reach.
So talk about a little bit about writing this book. Why did you decide to take on this topic? It seems different from the stuff that you've covered at least in your books in the past.
Yes. Well, part of it is, I am a journalist, and journalists are kind of generalists. And when you find a good story, you pursue it.
Yeah.
And so I heard about this group from friends who knew people in it. And I thought, wow, how could I have been living on the Upper West Side for decades and known nothing about this group that was basically hidden in plain sight?
Yeah.
Just down the block from me.
Amazing.
And I thought that's really weird and interesting. And it's really weird that people were trying, in however misguided way, to create an alternate utopian society, but not in an ashram in India or
upstate New York
in northern Vermont, but right here on the but right in the Upper West Side of Manhattan, and leading normal, going to normal jobs as high-performing professionals by day, and leading this, slightly wild alternate life by night. So that just really intrigued me, and I just started, reporting it. And, sometimes this happens with stories. You report something, and after you've done a few weeks of work, you think, okay, I have enough for a story. I'm ready to move on to something else. In this case, the deeper I got into it, the more interesting it became. And it just kept growing. And the first few people I interviewed then became a dozen, and then became a few dozen, and then it became 60 and 70.
Were people
and
eager
there
to
was
talk?
more I realized I understood about the group. They varied a lot. Some people were not eager at all, and some people were very gracious and quite ready to talk. Because a lot of people who'd been in this group in their 20s and 30s were now people in their 60s and 70s, and I think ready to reflect on their past. Other people didn't want anything to do with me. And then there were people who initially said no, who then 6 months or a year later would email me and say, are you still interested in talking about that thing?
Yeah.
And I'd say, sure. And that would be really, really interesting. It was just it was also just amazing, the stories they would tell, partly because these people had been in psychoanalysis for years and had been in basically a sex cult. They would tell you anything, and I mean anything.
Yeah.
So you say, well, you did what? And then what? And then this happened?
What were some of the crazy, I mean, they're probably in the book, but what was like something that kind of took your breath away?
Well, to give you an idea, like one of the things that was sort of amazing to me, there was a person I interviewed, and I interviewed her at least 3 or 4 times already. And then we're talking a 5th time, and a name comes up in the course of the interview. And she said, oh yeah, Didi Agee, I helped kidnap her son. And I said, what? I didn't want to actually show too much surprise, because I didn't want to stop her from talking. I just said, oh, that's interesting. Can you tell me about that? And so she tells me the story in which this woman, who I was very interested in, the story I was trying to reconstruct, had sent a 5-year-old child of hers to boarding school. The child had been miserable and left the board. The child's father, who was a well-known sculptor, had taken the child to live with him, where the child preferred to live. He didn't want to go back to boarding school. So the woman and her therapist say, you've got to get that child back, and you got to get him back in boarding school. So she rents a car, and she convinces 3 other people in the group, including my interview subject, to basically stake out the house of this father. And the mother goes to the front door and engages the father. And one of the other group members goes in the back door, he's met the little boy, and they get the little boy to come out with him, and they take the little boy into the car. And meanwhile, the father realizes what's going on, and he comes out with a baseball bat and smashes in the windshield of the car while they're all there in confusion. And they drive off with the car windows broken, and this
Oh my God,
terrified
traumatized
child in the back seat. And the child is taken not to be with his mother, very traumatized child. And the child is then taken back to boarding school, not to be with his mother, but to be where he doesn't want to be at age 5 at a boarding school, where he then is forced to live for a good part of his childhood. And his life was really, really damaged.
Did you? Yeah, I was going to ask you, like, so you've probably talked to some of the children of the cult.
A lot of the children.
They were probably in their 20s and their 30s. And do most of them have terrible things to say about it?
Most of them do. Some of them not as much. But, it's very, like the kid that was basically duped into going away to boarding school said at a certain point, I cannot remember a time which I didn't hate my parents. They did this to me, and I didn't want it to happen to me, and they didn't visit me, and it really sucked. There's another story of one of the people I interviewed, which to me was absolutely heartbreaking, where he's sent away to this awful boarding school in Arizona where they beat the kids and were terrible to them. And often the kids who were from the Sullivan group had to spend even the time during vacation. They weren't allowed to come home. They had to stay at the school that was shut down, boarding with personnel who happened to work at the school. There was some not very nice couple that, worked on maintenance of the school, and the mother made the kids run around a track so they could earn their dinner, even though these people were being paid to, take care of these kids.
Oh my God.
So one of these kids his father is not in the group anymore, and the mother is in the group. And so the father has partial custody, and he gets to go back to New York, and he spends a week with his dad and has a great time. He's a little kid of like 7 or 8 who gets to be with his parent, and the father is spending time with them, and it's great. And so he knows that the mother is going to send him back to this boarding school that's been shut down. And so the father says, well, why don't you just stay with me? What's the big deal? You're just going back, you're not going to be with her. You're just going to be at boarding school. Just stay here. So they go out for a walk into Central Park, and the father buys the little boy an ice cream, and they're walking along, and they notice somebody from the group, stretching on a jog. And they notice a second person from the group and a third person. And soon they realize they're being followed. And they're like, 4 or 5 people that are coming after them. So they race back to the dad's apartment, and there's a guy banging on the door, and there's a big fuss. And they call the cops, and the cops come, and they don't know what to make of this whole thing. And the cop asks the little boy, who do you want to be with, your mom or your dad? And he says, I want to be with my dad. But the father knows he doesn't have full legal custody, so he feels like he needs to contact the mother. They get the mother on the phone, and the mother says, you can be with your dad, but you will never see me again. You will never see me again in your life. And the boy turns to the father and says, what should I do? And the father waffles and says, gee, that's a big responsibility. I don't know that I can take that. Maybe you better go with your mom. And of course, the mother then picks the child up. She doesn't even take him back to her apartment. She has the plane tickets in her hand, drives him to LaGuardia Airport, and puts him on a plane back to Arizona. And, that's just like a heartbreaking moment that some of these kids had to endure.
And it's so selfish.
Yeah. And he never forgave that particular child. Just has very bitter feelings toward his parents. Luckily, he ended up as a functioning adult with a pretty good life and a family of his own. So he escaped, but he certainly has no kind feelings for his parents and for the group as a whole.
Yeah, this seems like a really quintessential sort of baby boomer, me generation kind of cult, where it's like all about my own personal growth at the expense of all these loved people around you, whether, you alienate your family, you alienate your children, but it's all about my growth. And And I find spirituality, I find cults in general are very much like this. They sort of are under the guise of being, about humanity and improving the world and stuff. But really, the people involved in cults tend to be very, very self-involved.
Yeah, that was certainly this kid's perception. And, I think what it did do was it offered people the very seductive opportunity of a prolonged adolescence.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point.
It's a little bit like at a certain point, I kind of used the metaphor of the lotus eaters in the Odyssey, where, Odysseus and his crew end up on this land where the lotus eaters are feeding this food to the crew that's just like so delicious and wonderful, and they just don't want to leave. They've completely forgotten about home.
Mm.
And so in a prolonged adolescence, for a while, that's like wonderful. No responsibility other than to yourself, and having a great time and sleeping lots of people and worrying about your own growth and development and your career. But then adolescence kind of wears thin. By the time these people got into their 30s, you think, okay, I've slept with all the people in the group. And I'm not moving forward. The therapy is completely static. And I'm a little tired of being told what to do.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm not allowed to have children. I'm not allowed to keep dating. They're actually now, since I'm sick of sleeping with everybody, there actually is one person that I really like a whole lot more than all the other people. And I'd like to make a life with that person.
Yeah.
And I can't do it. And my therapist is telling me, no, you can't do that. You're not ready. And so people outgrew it as, by the mid 30s, adolescents living as an adolescent becomes kind of tiresome. So that was one of the things I think broke the group up, is that people wanted to lead their own lives, wanted to have families, wanted to pair off with somebody they particularly cared for.
Meanwhile, look at the destruction they left behind.
Yeah.
It's an incredibly interesting book. It's called The Sullivanians: Sex, Psychotherapy, and the Wildlife of an American Commune. Thank you so much for joining me today on this
My pleasure.
call. It's been really, really interesting, Alexander.
Thanks for your interest in the book.